I took the night shift job as a security guard because I needed the money. It wasn't my first choice, but it paid well, and I thought it would be an easy job. My name is John, and this is the story of the scariest night of my life. The building I worked in was old and big. It used to be a factory, but now it was empty. My job was to walk around and make sure everything was okay. Every hour, I had to check all the rooms and write down that nothing was wrong. I started my shift at 10 p.m. and finished at 6 a.m. The first few nights were quiet. I brought a book to read and drank coffee to stay awake. I liked the silence. It gave me time to think, but on the fourth night, things changed. It started like any other night. I arrived at 9:45 p.m. and took over from the day guard, Bill. Bill was an old man who had worked there for years. He warned me about the noises. "This place is old," he said. "It creaks and groans. Don't let it scare you." I laughed and told him I wasn't afraid of a few noises. At 10 p.m. I began my first round. The building was dark and my flashlight made long shadows on the walls. I walked through the rooms, checking doors and windows. Everything was fine. At 11 p.m., I started my second round. This time, I heard something. It was a soft whispering sound. I stopped and listened. The whispering stopped, too. I shook my head and told myself it was just the wind. At midnight, I was in the basement. The basement was the creepiest part of the building. It was cold and damp, and it smelled like mold. I was about to leave when I heard the whispering again. This time, it was louder. It sounded like it was coming from the dark corner of the room. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice echoed in the empty room. There was no answer. I shone my flashlight into the corner, but there was nothing there. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly finished my check and went back upstairs. At 1 a.m., I was back in the main hall. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. My heart started to race. I told myself it was just my imagination. I tried to focus on my job, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At 2 a.m., I decided to take a break. I went to the security office and sat down. The office was small, with a desk, a chair, and a few monitors showing different parts of the building. I watched the monitors, hoping to see something that would explain the noises. But everything looked normal. At 3 a.m., I had to do my next round. I was nervous, but I forced myself to go. As I walked through the empty rooms, I felt like the shadows were closing in on me. The whispering started again, louder and clearer. It sounded like a voice, but I couldn't understand the words. I felt a cold breath on my neck and turned around quickly. Again, there was nothing there. I hurried through my check and went back to the office. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I needed the job. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just an old building making noises. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. At 4 a.m., I saw something on the monitors. In one of the rooms, there was a figure. It was tall and dark, and it didn't move. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the room. When I got there, it was empty. I searched the room, but there was no sign of anyone. I went back to the office, my hands shaking. I couldn't explain what I saw. I felt like I was losing my mind. I checked the monitors again, but the figure was gone. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't. At 5 a.m., I was exhausted. I just wanted the night to end. I decided to do one last round. As I walked through the building, I felt like I was being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I saw nothing. I reached the basement again. The whispering was louder than ever. It sounded like it was all around me. I felt a hand on my shoulder and spun around. There was no one there. I ran out of the basement and didn't stop until I reached the office. At 6 a.m., Bill arrived to take over. He took one look at me and asked what was wrong. I told him everything. He nodded and said, "You're not the first. This place is haunted. They say a worker died here years ago and never left." I quit that morning. I couldn't handle another night in that building. The memory of that night still haunts me. Sometimes I hear the whispering in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat. I'll never forget my time as a night shift security guard. When I was young, my parents bought a big old house in the middle of nowhere. They said it was a great deal. We moved in, excited about the fresh start. Little did we know, the house had a dark history, a history that would change our lives forever. The house was beautiful, in a way. Tall and proud, it stood alone with trees around it. It had big windows and a wide porch, but something about it felt off. The air was always cold, even in summer. Strange noises echoed at night. Sometimes I heard whispers when I was alone. I thought it was my imagination. My parents seemed happy at first. They worked hard to make the house a home. Dad painted the walls bright colors. Mom filled the rooms with flowers. They laughed and sang as they worked. But soon the laughter faded. The house seemed to drain their joy. They started arguing over small things. Dad's health began to decline, though the doctors found nothing wrong. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. I got up and saw my mom standing at the top of the stairs, staring into the darkness. Her eyes were empty, like she was in a trance. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. Then she turned and walked back to her room. The next morning, she didn't remember a thing. Things got worse. Dad became more and more ill. He was in pain all the time and couldn't work. Mom looked tired and sad. She started having strange dreams and couldn't sleep. I tried to help, but I was just a kid. I didn't understand what was happening. One evening, I found an old book in the attic. It was covered in dust, its pages yellowed with age. The book tells the story of the house. It had been built over 100 years ago by a man named Jonathan Crane. Jonathan was a rich but cruel man. He mistreated everyone, even his own family. His wife, Mary, was found dead in the house, and people said he had cursed her. After that, every family who lived there faced tragedy. There were fires, accidents, and unexplained deaths. I showed the book to my mom, but she didn't believe in curses. She said it was just an old story. She tried to burn the book, but it wouldn't catch fire. That night, the house seemed to come alive. Doors slammed shut, windows shattered, and the walls shook. It was like the house was angry. Dad died shortly after that night. His death was sudden and unexplained. The doctors were baffled. Mom was devastated. She couldn't cope and soon fell into a deep depression. She stopped eating, stopped talking, and finally, she too passed away. I was left alone in the house, feeling its cold grip around me. I moved away as soon as I could, but the house stayed with me, haunting my dreams. I kept thinking about its dark history and the families it had destroyed. I knew it wasn't over. The curse would continue with the next owners. Years passed, and new people bought the house. I hoped they would fare better, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't. The house's curse was too strong. Tragic stories followed. A young couple moved in, full of hope. They lost their child in a freak accident. A single man moved in next. He disappeared without a trace. I felt helpless. No matter how many times people tried to cleanse the house, the cycle of misfortune continued. Priests, shamans, and even modern paranormal investigators tried to break the curse, but nothing worked. The house remained a place of sorrow. Now, as an adult, I often drive by the old house. It still stands tall and proud, but I can see the sadness on its walls. I think about the families that have suffered there, including my own. I think about the lives lost, the dreams shattered, and I feel a burning desire to end it. I want to destroy the house, burn it to the ground, and end its legacy of sorrow. But I'm scared. What if the curse is too strong? What if destroying the house only makes things worse? I don't know what to do. I watch as a new family moves in. They seem happy and full of dreams. I hope they fare better, but deep down, I fear for them. I fear the house will claim them too, just like it did my parents and so many others. The cycle of misfortune seems unbreakable, but maybe, just maybe, there is a way to end it. I don't know how, but I have to try. I can't let the house continue to destroy lives. I owe it to my parents and to all the families who have suffered to find a way to break the curse. One day, I gather my courage and drive to the house. I stand in front of it, feeling its cold, dark presence. I take a deep breath and walk up the steps. The door creaks open and I step inside. The air is heavy, filled with sadness and anger. I can hear the whispers and feel the house watching me. I don't know what I will do, but I have to try. I have to end the curse once and for all. For my parents, for all the victims, and for the new family that now calls this house their home. The house has taken so much, but it won't take any more. Not if I can help it. I arrived at the rundown motel on Watt Avenue in Sacramento late one evening, tired from a long day on the road. The motel looked as shabby as the online reviews had warned, but it was cheap, and I was too exhausted to care. I checked in, got my room key, and dragged my heavy suitcase to room 12, hoping for a few hours of rest. The room was even worse than I had imagined. The wallpaper peeled off the walls, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. The bed, with its lumpy mattress and threadbare sheets, didn't look inviting at all. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the springs creak beneath me. As I sat there, I felt an itch on my arm. I scratched it, but then felt another itch on my leg. Looking closer, I saw tiny, reddish-brown bugs crawling on the bedspread. Bed bugs, just my luck. There was no way I could sleep on that bed now. I looked around the room for an alternative and noticed the small, grimy bathroom. The bathtub, while not exactly clean, seemed like a better option than the bug-infested bed. I grabbed a spare blanket from my suitcase and laid it out in the tub. It was hard and uncomfortable, but at least I wouldn't be eaten alive by bugs. I lay down in the tub, pulling my jacket over me for warmth. The hard surface made it difficult to fall asleep, but exhaustion eventually took over, and I drifted into a restless slumber. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. At first, I couldn't figure out what had disturbed me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the main room. My heart started to pound in my chest. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was just the wind or a stray animal. But then I heard a louder noise, like someone bumping into a piece of furniture. There was no mistaking it now, someone was in my room. I quietly reached for my pocket knife, the only weapon I had. My hands shook as I unfolded the blade, gripping it tightly. I slowly climbed out of the tub, careful not to make a sound, and crept towards the door, peeking through the small crack. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, I saw a shadow moving near my suitcase. My blood ran cold. An intruder was rummaging through my belongings. I had to do something, but I was terrified. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped into the room. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure froze and turned to face me. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with a scruffy beard and wild eyes. He looked as startled as I felt. We stood there, staring at each other, neither of us moving. Finally, the man broke the silence. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice shaky. "I thought this room was empty." I tightened my grip on the knife. "What are you doing in here?" I asked, my voice trembling. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm sorry. I was just looking for a place to sleep. I saw the window was unlocked and figured I could crash here for the night. I didn't know anyone was staying here." My mind raced. He didn't seem dangerous, but I couldn't be sure. "You need to leave," I said firmly, hoping he wouldn't notice how scared I was. The man nodded slowly. Okay, I'll go. I didn't take anything, I swear." He took a step towards the door, but then paused, looking back at me. "You should lock your window. It's not safe around here." I watched him warily as he walked to the door and slipped out into the night. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. My heart was still pounding, but I felt a small sense of relief. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, and tried to calm down. The reality of what had just happened slowly sank in. I had been seconds away from a potentially dangerous confrontation, and yet somehow it had ended without violence. Looking around the dingy room, I realized I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, checking the room to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. The itch on my arm reminded me of the bed bugs, and I shuddered at the thought. As I left the motel, I made sure to double-check the lock on my car door. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and I decided to drive to a nearby diner. I needed a strong cup of coffee and some time to gather my thoughts. Sitting in the diner, surrounded by the comforting hum of early morning chatter, I reflected on the night's events. It had been a terrifying experience, but I had made it through. I couldn't shake the intruder's final words from my mind. This place wasn't safe. I knew one thing for sure. I would be a lot more careful about where I chose to stay in the future. And I would always lock my window. My name is Sarah, and I live alone in a small house on the edge of town. It's a cozy place, surrounded by tall trees that sway gently in the wind. I've always loved the quiet, but lately, something strange has been happening. It started with small things. My food would disappear, or I'd find the kitchen window open when I was sure I had closed it. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft noise above me. It sounded like footsteps, light and hesitant, moving across the attic floor. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or a raccoon. But the next morning, I found more signs. An empty can of beans on the kitchen counter that I hadn't opened, crumbs on the floor, and the attic door slightly ajar. Gathering my courage, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly climbed the attic stairs. The air was musty, and dust particles danced in the beam of light. As I reached the top, I saw a small bed made of old blankets and a few empty cans of food. Someone had been living up here. I felt a mix of fear and curiosity. Who could it be? And why my house? I stayed awake that night, waiting and listening. Around midnight, I heard the noise again. I tiptoed to the kitchen and waited in the dark. Moments later, the figure of a man emerged from the attic. He was thin, with ragged clothes and a tired look in his eyes. He froze when he saw me. "Please don't call the police," he said softly, his voice shaking. "I have nowhere else to go." I could see the fear and desperation in his eyes. Something inside me softened. Instead of feeling scared, I felt a strange sense of empathy. "I'm not going to call the police," I replied, "but you need to tell me why you're here." His name was Jack. He had lost his job and home a few months ago and had been wandering the streets ever since. He found my attic one cold night and had been sneaking in for food and shelter. I thought about what to do. I couldn't let him keep living in the attic, but I also couldn't just turn him away. I decided to help him. I offered him a hot meal, and as we sat at the kitchen table, we talked. Jack told me about his life, his dreams, and how everything had fallen apart. I listened, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a connection with someone. The next day, I took Jack to a local shelter and helped him get in touch with some social services. We started working on his resume, and I reached out to some friends who might have job leads. Jack was grateful, and I could see him starting to hope again. Days turned into weeks, and Jack and I developed a routine. He would come by for meals, and we would work on job applications and practice interview skills. Slowly but surely, he started to regain his confidence. One evening, after he had left for the shelter, I realized how much my life had changed since he came into it. I no longer felt lonely. Jack had become a friend, someone I cared about deeply. One day, Jack came to my house with great news. He had landed a job at a local store. We celebrated with a homemade dinner, and I could see the pride in his eyes. He thanked me for believing in him when no one else did. I told him he deserved it and that I was proud of him. With his new job, Jack found a small apartment. He moved out of the shelter, and our visits became less frequent as he got busier. But we stayed in touch. He would come over for dinner once a week, and we'd catch up on each other's lives. Months passed, and Jack's life continued to improve. He got promoted at work, made new friends, and even started volunteering at the shelter where he once stayed. Seeing him grow and succeed filled my heart with joy. One evening, Jack invited me to his new apartment for dinner. As I walked in, I saw a framed photo on his wall of the two of us from one of our dinners. He smiled and said, "You changed my life, Sarah. I don't know where I'd be without you." Tears filled my eyes as I hugged him. "You changed mine too, Jack," I replied. "You reminded me of the power of kindness and how important it is to help each other." From that day on, Jack and I remained close friends. Our bond, born from a scary and uncertain situation, had turned into something beautiful. I learned that sometimes the scariest moments can lead to the most heartwarming outcomes, and that compassion and generosity can truly change lives. And so, my little house on the edge of town no longer felt empty. It was filled with memories of a friendship that had grown from the unlikeliest of places. And every time I heard the gentle creak of the attic, I smiled, remembering how it all began. I never liked working late. The silence of the empty office always made me uneasy, but I had no choice. The deadline was tomorrow, and I was way behind on my project. The office, usually bustling with the sounds of ringing phones and people chatting, was eerily quiet. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the building settling. My name is Tom, and I work as a graphic designer. It was a Friday night, and the office was deserted. Everyone else had left hours ago, excited for the weekend. I watched the last of my colleagues leave, envying their freedom. I took a deep breath and turned back to my computer, determined to finish my work. As the hours passed, the light outside my window dimmed until it was pitch black. The only light in the office came from my computer screen and the small desk lamp beside me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shook it off. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I never liked working late. Around midnight, I decided to take a break. I stood up and stretched, my muscles aching from sitting in the same position for so long. I walked over to the break room to get a cup of coffee. The hallway was dark, and my footsteps echoed on the tile floor. I flipped the switch, and the fluorescent lights flickered to life, casting a harsh, cold light. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, taking a sip. The warmth of the coffee was comforting. As I stood there, I thought I heard a noise. It was faint, almost like a whisper. I paused, straining to listen, but there was nothing. Just the hum of the vending machine and the distant sound of the city outside. I shook my head and chuckled nervously. "You're losing it, Tom," I muttered to myself. I finished my coffee and headed back to my desk. As I walked down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. When I reached my desk, I noticed something strange. My computer screen had gone black. I jiggled the mouse, but nothing happened. I frowned and tried to turn it back on, but it was completely dead. Frustrated, I checked the power cable and saw that it had been unplugged. I felt a chill run through me. I knew I hadn't unplugged it. My hands trembled as I plugged it back in and turned the computer on. The screen flickered to life, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But my relief was short-lived. A message popped up on the screen: "Get out." I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. This had to be a prank. Someone was messing with me. But who? Everyone had left hours ago. I looked around the empty office, half expecting to see someone hiding, but there was no one. I decided to ignore the message and get back to work. I was probably just tired and seeing things. I opened my project file and tried to focus, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. Minutes passed, and I forced myself to work, but the unease only grew stronger. I kept glancing at the clock, hoping the night would end soon. Suddenly, I heard the noise again. This time, it was louder. It sounded like footsteps coming from the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The sound stopped. I took a deep breath and walked towards the hallway, my steps slow and cautious. The corridor was empty, just as it had been before. I decided to check the office one more time, just to be sure. I walked past empty desks and cubicles, my eyes scanning every shadow. As I reached the far end of the office, I noticed something strange. One of the doors to a small conference room was slightly ajar. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Gathering my courage, I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. I reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Panic set in, and I pounded on the door, shouting for help. But my voice echoed back at me, unanswered. Then I heard it again. The whisper. It was close, so close that I could feel the breath on my neck. I turned around slowly, my eyes wide with fear. In the corner of the room, a shadow moved. It was a figure, standing still, watching me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, silent and menacing. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the figure. The light revealed an old, dusty mannequin, its glassy eyes staring blankly ahead. I let out a shaky laugh. It was just a mannequin, someone's idea of a joke. I walked over to the door, trying to calm my racing heart. As I reached for the doorknob, the whisper came again. This time, it was unmistakable. "Get out," it said, the voice low and chilling. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The mannequin hadn't moved, but the voice was so close, it was as if it were right next to me. I didn't wait to find out more. I yanked the door open with a burst of strength I didn't know I had and ran down the hallway. I grabbed my bag and sprinted for the exit, not looking back. I burst out of the building and into the cool night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I never went back to that office at night again. I finished my project from home, and no deadline was worth the terror I felt that night. To this day, I don't know what I experienced. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe it was something else, something beyond explanation. All I know is that I will never forget the whisper that told me to get out. It was a cold, quiet evening when my family left for their trip. I waved them goodbye, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. I had the whole house to myself for the weekend. I planned to catch up on my favorite TV shows and eat junk food. The thought of being alone didn't scare me at first, but as the night went on, a strange feeling started to creep in. The house was too quiet. Every creak and groan of the old wood seemed louder than usual. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. I settled on the couch with a bowl of popcorn and turned on the TV. The light from the screen flickered across the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. After a while, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like a soft tap. I paused the TV and listened, but the noise stopped. I shrugged it off, thinking it must be the house settling. I turned back to my show, trying to lose myself in the story. But then I heard it again. This time, it was louder and more persistent. It wasn't just a tap, it was a knock. My heart started to race. I got up and walked slowly to the kitchen. I peeked around the corner, but everything looked normal. The doors and windows were all shut. I let out a sigh of relief and turned to go back to the living room. That's when I saw him. A man, standing outside the kitchen window, staring right at me. His face was pale, his eyes wide and wild. He had a scruffy beard and wore dirty, tattered clothes. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. He raised his hand and tapped on the window again, harder this time. I snapped out of my trance and backed away, my mind racing. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. "What's your emergency?" the operator's calm voice asked. "There's a man outside my window," I whispered, afraid he might hear me. "He's trying to get in." "Stay on the line," she said. "Help is on the way. Can you lock yourself in a room?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yes, I can." I ran upstairs and locked myself in my bedroom. I sat on the floor, back against the door, trying to keep calm. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The operator stayed on the line, reassuring me that the police were on their way. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash. The man had broken the window. He was inside the house. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. I could hear his footsteps on the stairs, getting closer and closer. "He's in the house," I whispered to the operator, my voice shaking. "Stay quiet and stay where you are," she replied. "The police are almost there." I heard him trying the doors, one by one. When he reached my bedroom door, he started banging on it, trying to break it down. I pushed harder against the door, praying it would hold. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. The banging got louder and more desperate. Just when I thought the door would give in, I heard sirens in the distance. The man must have heard them too, because the banging stopped. Everything went silent. I listened carefully. Then I heard the sound of running footsteps, followed by the front door slamming shut. He was trying to escape. Moments later, I heard voices downstairs. The police had arrived. "It's okay, the police are here," the operator said. "You can open the door now." I slowly unlocked the door and stepped out. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I made my way downstairs, where two police officers were waiting. They looked at me with concern. "Are you all right?" one of them asked. I nodded, still in shock. "He broke in through the window," I said, my voice trembling. "We got him," the other officer said. "He's in custody now. You're safe." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The nightmare was over. The officers stayed with me until my parents returned, making sure I was safe and secure. I told them everything that had happened, and they assured me that the man would be taken care of. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face at the window. But I was grateful that it was over, and that I was safe. The police told us later that the man was a drifter with a history of breaking. He had been caught several times, but always managed to escape. This time they promised he wouldn't get away. From that night on, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked tight before I went to bed. I also got an alarm system installed. The experience had shaken me to my core, but it had also taught me to be more careful. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I was 12 years old the first time I stayed home alone at night. My parents were going to a dinner party, and they promised to be back by 10. I was excited at first. Finally, a night of freedom. I could eat as much ice cream as I wanted and watch scary movies until I fell asleep. It was going to be great. The night started well. I had my favorite ice cream flavor, chocolate chip cookie dough, and my favorite blanket wrapped around me. I decided to watch a movie I had seen a dozen times before, but it always scared me just the right amount. It was about a haunted house, and even though I knew every twist and turn, it still made my heart race. It was around 9 o'clock when I first heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible noise coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again. It sounded like someone was walking around up there. I paused the movie and listened intently. The house was silent. Maybe it was just the old house settling, I told myself. I had heard my parents say that 100 times before. Trying to shake off the unease, I resumed my movie. But I couldn't focus. Every little sound made me jump. The wind outside howled, making the tree branches scrape against the windows like long, bony fingers. The sound was eerie, but I told myself it was nothing. Just the wind. Then I heard the noise again, louder this time. It was coming from upstairs. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my phone and texted my mom, "Are you guys almost home?" I waited, but there was no reply. I checked the time. It was only 9:15. They wouldn't be home for at least another 45 minutes. I decided to be brave. I stood up, clutching my blanket like a shield, and crept towards the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my feet, and I winced at every sound. I reached the top of the stairs and listened. Silence. I took a deep breath and started checking each room. The first room I checked was my parents' bedroom. I pushed the door open slowly and peeked inside. It was dark, but everything looked normal. Next, I checked my room. Again, nothing unusual. I started to feel a bit silly. Maybe it was just the house settling. I was about to go back downstairs when I heard it again. This time, the sound was coming from the attic. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, and a chill ran down my spine. I had always been scared of the attic. It was dark and full of old, creepy things my parents had collected over the years. I never went up there, but tonight, something was different. I felt like I had to check it out. I slowly approached the attic door, my heart pounding louder than ever. I reached out and pushed the door open all the way. The stairs leading up to the attic were steep and narrow. I hesitated for a moment, but then I heard the noise again, clear and unmistakable. It was a faint, shuffling sound, like someone or something was moving up there. I took a deep breath and started climbing the stairs. They creaked loudly with each step, and I felt like I was walking into a nightmare. When I reached the top, I saw the attic was even darker than I remembered. I fumbled for the light switch and finally found it. The light flickered on, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I looked around, my eyes scanning the room. Old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs filled every corner. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to turn around and leave when I noticed something strange. One of the old trunks was slightly open. I knew it had always been closed before. I walked over to the trunk, my hands trembling. I reached out and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing but old clothes and a few books. I let out a sigh of relief. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again. This time it was right behind me. I spun around and my heart almost stopped. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall and cloaked in darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. What was this thing? How did it get into my house? I took another step back, and the figure moved closer. I could hear my heartbeat, loud and frantic. Then the figure spoke. Its voice was low and cold. "You shouldn't be here," it said. "This is my home now." I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I flew down the attic stairs, almost tripping in my haste. I ran down the hall and back down the main staircase. I grabbed my phone and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was halfway down the street. I called my parents, my hands shaking so much I could barely dial. When they finally answered, I told them everything. They rushed home and called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the entire house, including the attic. They found nothing. No sign of the figure I had seen. They told my parents it was probably my imagination, that maybe I had watched one too many scary movies. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew I would never forget that night. I never felt safe in that house again, especially when I was alone, because I knew, somewhere in the shadows, that figure was still there, watching, waiting. It was a dark and stormy night. The kind of night where the wind howled like a ghost and the rain poured down in sheets, making it hard to see the road ahead. I was sitting in the back seat of our old reliable car, and my mom was driving. We were on our way back home from visiting Grandma. The trip was long and I was tired. My eyes felt heavy, and I could feel myself drifting off to sleep. Suddenly, the car came to a screeching halt, jerking me awake. I was thrown forward, my seatbelt digging into my chest. I looked up and saw a man standing in the middle of the road. He was drenched from the rain and his clothes were tattered and dirty. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see his eyes. They were wild and frantic, like a cornered animal. My mom gasped and quickly locked the doors. She kept her foot on the brake, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. We both stared at the man, unsure of what to do. He looked desperate, but something about him felt wrong. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the fear creeping up my spine. Before we could react, 3 more men emerged from the shadows. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, like ghosts in the night. They surrounded the car, banging on the windows and pulling at the door handles. My mom screamed, and I could see the terror in her eyes. "Lock your doors," she shouted. "Keep them locked." I did as she said, fumbling with a lock on my door. My hands were shaking, and I could barely breathe. The men were shouting, their voices muffled by the rain and the closed windows. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I knew it wasn't good. One of the men had a crowbar, and he started hitting the driver's side window with it. The glass held firm, but I could see small cracks forming. My mom's eyes were wide with fear, and I knew we didn't have much time. "Hold on tight," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm gonna get us out of here." She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. The man with the crowbar jumped back just in time, avoiding the car by inches. The other men scattered, shouting angrily as we sped down the road. The car skidded and swerved on the wet pavement, but my mom kept it under control. She drove as fast as she could, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. I looked back and saw the men growing smaller and smaller in the distance. My heart was still pounding, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. "Are you okay?" my mom asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I nodded, but I didn't trust myself to speak. I was too scared. My mom reached back and squeezed my hand, her grip reassuring but still trembling. "We're safe now," she said. "It's okay, we're safe." We drove in silence for a while, the only sound of the rain beating against the car and the hum of the engine. My mind was racing with thoughts and questions. Who were those men? What did they want? Why were they trying to get into our car? As we neared our neighborhood, the rain began to let up, and the storm started to pass. The sky was still dark, but I could see the faint glow of streetlights ahead. I started to relax a little, feeling the tension in my body begin to ease. When we finally pulled into our driveway, my mom parked the car and turned off the engine. She took a deep breath and looked at me. "Always lock your doors," she said. "No matter where you are or how safe you think it is. Always lock your doors." I nodded again, understanding the importance of her words. That night had been a terrifying reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. It was a lesson neither of us would ever forget. As we walked into the house, my mom wrapped her arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. The warmth and safety of home felt like a comforting blanket, wrapping us in its embrace. We were safe, and that was all that mattered. We didn't talk much about what had happened that night, but the memory lingered. It was a sobering reminder to always be cautious, to always be aware of our surroundings, and to always lock our doors. It was a lesson that had been learned the hard way, but one that would keep us safe in the future.